We're talking actually about bee being used to detect cancer. The end goal is not to use a bee, but to replicate how the bee's brain is firing on a computer chip.
SciAnts. We get experimental science. We're curious, non-judgmental.
But yeah, we're talking science news of the week tonight. We're talking actually about bee being used to detect cancer. So this study is that bees can smell certain elements and the concentration of those elements associated with lung cancer. And they can smell it from human breath. So, Cricket, I have an image for you. Here is the image. So this essentially, the tube here is your blowing into a tube. And the bees can detect an odor and tell the concentration of the odor and detect if there is, lung cancer. Now, we've had a study like this before. The study before was not on lung cancer. I think it was on colorectal cancer and using ants. And in that previous study, what researchers did was they trained an ant to identify an odor that was associated with a sugar reward. And the odor was from cancer cells. Now, it turns out that disease states have odor. There's change in metabolism during disease, and that's when you're breathing out this odorant. And so your essentially cells will also produce this in a dish. And when that ends up happening, the odor comes out, the insects can detect it, and they're trained to detect it and get a sugar reward. So that's a little bit what happens on that front. So let's dig into a little bit of it. So they wanted to see if they can actually tell between different chemicals. So they had a list of chemicals and what compounds they were looking at, and they wanted to see, what's on healthy breath versus someone that has lung cancer. And so they developed basically a recipe. They developed a recipe for synthetic breath. So here is a breath of someone that is not having lung cancer. And they used 6 different compounds because what they found was when a bunch of people essentially breathe into a mass spectrometer, a fancy breathalyzer that tells you what components are in there, there were 6 compounds that were highly expressed. There was a lot of them in there. So they're like, okay, these 6 compounds make our regular wild type synthetic breath. And then they tested lung cancer. With lung cancer, they made a synthetic lung cancer breath, but that was actually a bunch of different varieties. The reason they had a bunch of different varieties was because of the lung cancer patients, they had different components in their breath. There were some that clustered together, but it seemed like it depended on what kind of lung cancer you have, like what was the mutation there. But so what they ended up doing then, the reason they picked bees is because generally insects like bees and ants have a really good sense of smell. So what they did was they 3D printed a harness for the bee. I have an image of this as well. So here is the 3D printed bee harness. It's being itself, being its best self. The head is immobilized and the body is sticking through. So it's just a way to hold the bee and not injure it. They then have the other image that we looked at. They're puffing the air onto the antennae. As they're doing that, they also have electrodes in the brain of the animal and they see what neurons are spiking when. So what is the neuronal firing response for it? Where are the neurons firing when this particular odor is presented? What was really cool was the bees were able to detect really, really small concentrations. So we're talking 1 part per billion. 1 part per billion units is what they were able to detect on there. So that's a extremely low level of it. Jehovah, so with the ants, they were not they didn't seem to be stressed because it was paired with reward. Here with the electrodes into the brains of the creatures, it's kind of a one-shot. You can do the test and then you take out the electrodes and you put them back into the hive, but you're probably not going to test that particular insect again, primarily because you've already pierced the exoskeleton. But yeah, you can see the neural wavelengths in the data. We'll look at that in a moment. And they were just being able to see how the animals are smelling differently at different odorants. And so again, for the experiments, they use different kinds of lung cell lines grown in these airtight flasks and then use the honeybee sensor. And so what they found was the bees' neuronal firing was different based on what kind of lung cancer it was. So if it was a small cell lung cancer, non-small cell lung cancer, or healthy cell, you had a different firing profile of the neurons. So the idea is, and they were consistent between 40 different bees that were tested, it was the same kind of firing spike depending on what was tested. So the idea is, let's take a dish of lung cancer, stick it up to this bee, have the electrodes in the brain, and however those neurons fire is a way to diagnose what kind of cancer it is, in like a cheap, ideally reliable way. And again, the biggest thing that they wanted to point out in this study that is different from the ant study, and this could be because the ant study, they didn't have the electrodes in the brain. In the ant study, they just kind of let ants loose and gave them a dish of cancer cell and non-cancer cell, and they just went towards the odor they were trained on. Here, it's much finer resolution, but they're pointing out that this is not just telling the presence or absence of cancer, this is telling you presence or absence and what kind of cancer is there. And so again, their idea and hope is that this could be a future tester and sensor for like specific kinds of cancer and fast diagnoses so that you can have the correct treatment type. Also, they're hoping that this will be an additional way to test, like maybe checking on other animals to do the same kind of testing. And then they were also hoping to eventually build, like the neat thing about this is that it's a non-invasive test and that they can breathe in a sensor. And I guess a big thing too is that the end goal is not to use a bee, but to replicate how the bee's brain is firing on on a computer chip. So like whatever the bee is detecting, like how the bee is detecting this and what the firing of that is, if you could synthesize that and like on a chip, like just replicate what's going on in that particular region of the insect brain, then you'd have a way to diagnose particular kinds of lung cancer and the presence or absence of lung cancer as well. Bees effectively being as a track. Yep, exactly, Jehovah. And yeah, you're right. I don't think they can adopt it large scale with the bees because you'd have to have the right kind of facility that can actually test and utilize, grow up, testing, utilization of bees, all those elements, right? That one's not straightforward to do. But the next adaptation, which could be the computer element to it, that would be really cool to see if that could be adaptable and then, adopted large scale. I think it's great because of the resolution of what it can do, but on top of that, not just the resolution, but the fact that it's non-invasive, right? And if it's reliably working non-invasive, where you just breathe into a tube and then you figure out what kind of cancer you have and what you need for treatment, like that is huge. And so that would be a really, really exciting thing to be able to test one day. And because it's this synthetic breath, they're actually able to tell the difference and figure out, okay, what are the compounds that the animal is detecting versus anywhere else. That bee did not require training. They just naively, like never before exposed, they gave the bee this odor and they looked at the neuronal spikes and they were different depending on what cocktail they gave them, right? So there was no training involved. It was just the bee's brain could tell the difference between the different types of cancer reliably. So there's no training. You're just hijacking the nervous system and making a fake brain on a chip one day and seeing what comes out of it, which is amazing. So for Wombat, for at least the bee study, of the 40 bees that they tested, it was extremely reliable, where every time that they did the experiment, it was the same neuronal cluster that fired, depending on which thing that the animal was smelling. So for that, it seems like there isn't really an issue with the false positives. Some smell does come from bacteria, but when we have diseases, your body's metabolism changes and you breathe it out. That's why the breath detection, for the lung cancer part, it's not just that it's coming from the lungs and breathing out, but the same thing if you have pancreatic cancer or anything else, your body gives off a different odor because of the different metabolism that's happening as a function of just cancer. So cancer cells inherently have a different metabolic properties than non-cancerous cells, and that is a connection to odor there as well. Yeah, exactly, Wombat. But yeah, that's pretty much it for the paper. I don't think they had a nice summary figure, if I'm remembering correctly. That's one thing I did not enjoy. Yeah, I don't think there was a summary figure. But yeah, there's a lot of methodology, a lot of citations, and I think a very nicely put together paper. So all in all, I think are really pretty exciting to talk about, and I hope you all enjoy them as well.